This is the Archivist. Tonight, we discover why even the hardiest souls would struggle to survive a single winter night in the far northern reaches where the Vikings made their homes. We step softly into a world where survival meant understanding fire like a living thing, where warmth was earned through wisdom passed down through generations, and where the longest nights taught lessons about endurance we have nearly forgotten. The scroll unfolds now, and the cold wind carries us back to a time when winter was not a season to endure, but a master to respect. The final leaves had long since surrendered to the wind, and the earth beneath my feet held that particular hardness that comes only when frost has claimed it completely. I found myself standing at the edge of a settlement that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of preparation. Every soul within its boundaries moving with the quiet urgency of those who understood what was coming. This was somewhere in the 10th century, in the lands we now call Norway, though the people here would have known it simply as home. The settlement stretched along a protected inlet where the dark water reflected the last pale light of what would be the final mild day for many months to come. Smoke rose from every dwelling, not the lazy summer smoke of cooking fires, but the thick, purposeful smoke of hearths being tested, chimneys being cleared, and fires being built that would not be allowed to die until spring returned. I watched as a woman named Astrid moved between the buildings, her breath visible in small puffs as she checked each dwelling's preparations. Her hands, already roughened by the work of autumn, carried a small iron tool, a poker worn smooth by countless winters of use. She paused at each doorway, listening to the sound of the fires within, reading the smoke that rose from each roof like others might read runes carved in stone. The air itself seemed to carry warnings. There was a particular stillness that came before the deep cold, a hush that settled over the land like a held breath. The few remaining birds had long since departed for warmer shores, and even the hardy ravens that usually called from the pine trees had grown quiet, as if they too understood that the time for casual chatter had passed. In the largest of the buildings, what we might call the Great Hall, I could hear the sound of wood being split and stacked. The rhythm was steady, methodical, almost meditative. Each strike of the axe was followed by the soft thud of split wood falling onto growing piles. This was not the hurried chopping of those caught unprepared, but the careful, measured work of people who had learned, through generations of survival, exactly how much fuel would be needed to see them through until the ice broke and the world softened once more. The children of the settlement moved differently too, their summer games forgotten in favor of tasks that would soon become matters of life and death. I watched a boy of perhaps 10 winters carefully arranging kindling in a leather pouch, selecting each piece with the seriousness of a craftsman choosing his finest tools. His sister, slightly younger, practiced the art of fire starting with flint and steel, her small fingers working with a patience that spoke of many lessons learned beside the hearth. As the sun began its early descent toward the horizon, for the days were already growing short, the settlement took on an almost sacred quality. Every action seemed deliberate, every preparation weighted with the knowledge of what failure might mean. The Vikings who lived here were not the raiders of legend in this moment, but simply people facing the same challenge that had tested their ancestors for countless generations: how to keep the spark of life burning when the world itself seemed determined to extinguish it. The wind picked up as evening approached, carrying with it the scent of snow still days away, but already gathering in the distant mountains. It was a clean, sharp smell that seemed to cut through the warmer odors of wood smoke and cooking food, a reminder that comfort was temporary and vigilance was the price of survival. I found myself drawn to the doorway of one particular dwelling, where the sound of quiet conversation mixed with the crackle of a well-tended fire. Through the partially open door, I could see the warm glow of flames dancing against walls lined with furs and woven hangings. The sight was inviting, almost hypnotic, but I knew that what appeared to be simple comfort was actually the result of knowledge accumulated over lifetimes. Knowledge about fire, about fuel, about the delicate balance between warmth and waste that would determine who lived to see another spring. The last light faded from the sky, and the settlement settled into the rhythm of its first long night. But this was only the beginning, a gentle introduction to the months of cold that lay ahead. The real test would come later, when the snow lay deep and the wind howled like a living thing, when the difference between life and death could be measured in the warmth of a single ember kept alive through the darkest hours before dawn. As the first true cold settled over the land like a heavy blanket, I began to understand that survival here was not a matter of enduring the winter, but of creating a partnership with it. The buildings themselves were the first line of defense, and every beam, every stone, every carefully placed timber spoke of lessons learned through trial and error across generations. The longhouse where I found myself was a marvel of practical engineering, though its builders would never have used such grand words. They would have simply called it home, and home it was. But home designed by people who understood that the difference between warmth and cold could be measured in inches of wood, in the angle of a roof, in the careful placement of a door. The walls were thick, thicker than seemed necessary until you felt the first bitter wind of true winter. They were built of timber and stone, with the gaps between filled with a mixture of clay, moss, and whatever other materials could be found to keep the cold air from finding its way inside. But it was not just the thickness that mattered. It was the way the walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the temperature changes, settling into themselves like a living thing finding its most comfortable position. I watched as Bjorn, a man whose hands bore the calluses of many winters' worth of building and repair, moved along the interior walls with a small oil lamp, checking for drafts. His movements were slow and methodical, and wherever he found even the smallest current of cold air, he would pause to pack more moss into the gap, or to adjust a hanging that had shifted in the wind. This was not work that could be rushed or ignored. It was the kind of careful maintenance that meant the difference between a warm night's sleep and waking to find frost on the inside of the walls. The roof above was equally thoughtful in its construction. The wooden beams were massive, cut from trees that had grown slowly in the northern climate, their wood dense and strong. But it was not just strength that mattered. It was the way the roof was designed to hold heat, like a cupped hand holds water. The peak was high enough to allow smoke to rise and escape, but not so high that precious warm air would be lost in empty space above the heads of those who needed it most. Beneath the main beams, layers of birch bark and turf created a barrier that was both waterproof and insulating. The turf, in particular, was a marvel of natural engineering. Cut in thick slabs from the earth and laid like giant shingles, it provided insulation that improved with age as the roots and organic matter settled and compressed into an almost impermeable barrier against the cold. But perhaps most ingenious of all was the way the floor was constructed. Rather than simply laying boards over the earth, the builders had created a system of raised platforms and sunken areas that worked with the natural behavior of warm and cold air. The main living area was slightly elevated, allowing the warmest air to pool where people sat and slept. while the areas near the doors and walls were lower, creating natural channels for cold air to flow away from the living spaces. I found myself particularly fascinated by the hearth itself, not just the fire pit, but the entire system of stones, clay, and carefully shaped metal that turned simple burning wood into a source of heat that could warm an entire building. The hearth was positioned not in the center of the room, as one might expect, but slightly off-center, in a location that had been chosen through generations of experimentation to provide the most efficient distribution of heat. The stones that surrounded the fire were not random rocks picked up from the ground, but carefully selected pieces that had been tested for their ability to absorb heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. Some were smooth river stones that held heat like living coals. Others were rougher pieces of granite that radiated warmth in steady, gentle waves. Each stone had its place and its purpose, and together they created a thermal mass that could keep a room warm long after the flames had died down to glowing embers. Above the hearth, a system of iron chains and hooks allowed for the careful management of cooking pots and heating stones, but more than that, it created a way to control the flow of heat and smoke, directing the warmth where it was needed most, while ensuring that the smoke found its way to the opening in the roof without filling the living space with choking fumes. The chimney itself was a work of art disguised as simple function. Built of stone and clay, it was designed not just to carry smoke away, but to extract every possible bit of heat from that smoke before it escaped into the cold night air. The interior walls of the chimney were lined with stones that absorbed heat from the rising smoke and radiated it back into the room, creating a secondary source of warmth that continued long after the fire had been banked for the night. As I moved through the longhouse, I began to see how every element worked together to create a system of warmth that was greater than the sum of its parts. The thick walls held heat in, the carefully designed roof kept cold air out, the raised floors directed warm air where it was needed, and the hearth system extracted every possible calorie of heat from the precious fuel that had been gathered and stored through the warmer months. But perhaps most impressive of all was the way the building seemed to adapt to the changing conditions outside. On nights when the wind howled and the cold pressed against the walls like a living thing, the longhouse seemed to hunker down, drawing its warmth inward and holding it close. On calmer nights, when the cold was less fierce, the building seemed to relax, allowing a gentle circulation of air that kept the interior fresh without sacrificing precious heat. This was architecture born of necessity, refined by experience, and perfected through the kind of trial and error that could mean the difference between life and death. Every beam, every stone, every carefully placed piece of turf was a testament to the ingenuity of people who had learned to work with winter rather than simply endure it. In the deep heart of winter, when the world outside had become a realm of ice and howling wind, I came to understand that fire was not simply a tool for the Vikings, it was a living companion, as essential to survival as breath itself, and far more fragile. The art of keeping fire alive through the longest, coldest nights was a skill passed down from parent to child like a sacred trust, for to let the fire die was to invite death into the home. I found myself watching Ingrid, a woman whose weathered hands moved with the confidence of someone who had tended fires for more winters than she could count. Her movements around the hearth were like a dance, each gesture purposeful and precise. She understood fire not as a simple chemical reaction, but as a temperamental creature that needed to be fed, coaxed, and carefully managed if it was to provide the warmth that would see her family through until dawn. The wood she used was not simply whatever could be found and chopped. Each piece had been selected for its specific properties, cut at the right time of year, and seasoned for exactly the right amount of time. The oak logs, thick as a man's thigh, burned slowly and steadily, providing the deep, lasting heat that would form the foundation of the fire. These were the logs that would be placed carefully in the evening and would still be glowing red in the morning, their dense wood releasing heat in measured doses throughout the long night. But oak alone was not enough. Birch bark, peeled in long strips and dried until it was crisp as parchment, served as the kindling that could coax even the most reluctant ember back to life. The bark contained oils that burned hot and fast, perfect for those moments when the fire seemed to be dying and needed a quick burst of flame to catch hold of larger fuel. I watched as Ingrid kept a supply of this bark in a leather pouch that hung always within reach of the hearth, ready for those critical moments when speed could mean the difference between warmth and cold. Pine, with its resinous wood, burned bright and hot but quickly. It was perfect for the times when immediate heat was needed, when someone came in from the cold and needed to warm themselves quickly, or when the morning fire needed to be built up rapidly to chase away the chill that had crept in during the night. But pine had to be used carefully, for it could consume itself too quickly, leaving nothing but ash and the need to start over. The arrangement of the wood in the fire was an art form in itself. Ingrid would place the largest logs at the back of the hearth, where they would catch the heat reflected from the stone wall and burn slowly and evenly. Smaller pieces were arranged in front, creating a careful architecture of fuel that would burn in sequence, each piece catching fire from the one before it, creating a chain of combustion that could last for hours without attention. But it was not just the wood that mattered, it was the air. Fire needed to breathe, and Ingrid understood this as well as she understood the need for her own breath. She would use a bellows made of leather and wood to provide gentle puffs of air when the fire needed encouragement, but never too much, for too much air could cause the fire to burn too hot and consume its fuel too quickly. The bellows itself was a marvel of simple engineering, crafted from the hide of a cow and fitted with wooden valves that allowed air to be drawn in and then expelled in controlled bursts. The rhythm of its use was almost musical, a gentle whoosh of air followed by a pause, then another whoosh, each breath timed to the needs of the fire. I watched as Ingrid worked the bellows with one hand while arranging fuel with the other, her attention split between the immediate needs of the flame and the longer-term strategy of keeping heat available through the night. The ashes, too, were not waste, but an essential part of the fire-keeping system. Rather than being swept away, they were carefully managed, pushed to one side of the hearth, where they formed an insulating bed that helped hold heat and could be used to bank coals for the night. When it came time to sleep, Ingrid would rake the glowing coals into the ash bed, covering them partially to slow their burning while still allowing enough air to keep them alive. This banking of the fire was perhaps the most critical skill of all, for it determined whether there would be live coals to restart the fire in the morning, or whether the long, dangerous process of creating fire from scratch would be necessary. I learned that there were different techniques for different types of nights. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled and the walls themselves seemed to contract with the cold, the fire would be built larger and fed more frequently. But on milder nights, a smaller, more carefully managed fire was preferred, one that would provide steady heat without consuming too much of the precious fuel that had to last until spring. The tools of firekeeping were simple but essential. Iron pokers, worn smooth by countless nights of use, allowed for the careful rearrangement of burning logs without disturbing the delicate balance of the fire. Wooden shovels, their edges charred from years of service, were used to manage the ashes and coals. And always, within easy reach, were the materials needed to restart a fire if the worst should happen: flint and steel, tinder made from charred cloth, and the precious birch bark that could catch even the smallest spark and nurse it into flame. But perhaps most important of all was the knowledge itself, the understanding of how fire behaved, what it needed, and how to read its moods. Ingrid could tell by the color of the flames whether the fire was getting enough air, by the sound of the burning wood whether it was too wet or too dry, by the way the smoke rose whether the chimney was drawing properly. This knowledge had been passed down to her from her mother, who had learned it from her mother before her, an unbroken chain of wisdom that stretched back through generations of women who had kept their families alive through the long northern winters. As the night deepened and the cold pressed more insistently against the walls, I watched Ingrid perform the final ritual of the evening, the banking of the fire that would determine whether her family would wake to warmth or to the dangerous cold of a dead hearth. Her movements were slow and deliberate, each placement of coal and ash calculated to provide the best chance of finding live embers in the morning. It was a moment of quiet faith, a trust in the ancient partnership between human knowledge and the elemental power of fire that had sustained her people through countless winters before this one. As the deepest part of winter settled over the land like a heavy quilt, I began to understand that survival was not just about staying warm. It was about creating a rhythm of life that could sustain both body and spirit through the long months when the sun barely rose above the horizon and the world outside became a place of ice and endless night. The rhythm began before the sunset, which in the depths of winter happened so early that it felt like the day had barely begun. I watched as the household of Eric the Steady, a man whose name spoke to his reputation for careful preparation, moved through their evening preparations with the practiced efficiency of those who understood that every action in these months carried weight. The first task was always the checking of the animals. The cattle, sheep, and goats that had been brought close to the longhouse for the winter were not just livestock. They were partners in survival, their body heat contributing to the overall warmth of the settlement, their milk and occasional meat providing sustenance when other food grew scarce. Eric's son Magnus, a young man whose beard was still sparse, but whose understanding of winter was already deep, would make his way through the animal shelters with a small oil lamp, checking that each creature was warm enough, that their water had not frozen, that they had sufficient fodder to last through the night. The animals themselves seemed to understand the gravity of the season. The cattle stood close together, their breath creating small clouds of steam in the cold air. The sheep, with their thick winter coats, huddled in groups that shifted and reformed as they sought the warmest positions. Even the chickens, usually scattered and independent, gathered together in tight clusters, sharing their body heat in a display of cooperation that spoke to the universal understanding that winter was not a time for individual pride. Inside the longhouse, the women began the careful process of preparing the evening meal, not just cooking, but creating food that would provide maximum warmth and energy for the long night ahead. I watched as Solveig, Eric's wife, prepared a stew that was more than simple sustenance. The ingredients had been chosen not just for their flavor, but for their ability to warm the body from within. The meat was mutton, cut from animals that had been slaughtered earlier in the winter and preserved in the cold. But it was not just thrown into the pot. It was prepared in a way that would extract every possible bit of nutrition and warmth. The bones were cracked to release their marrow, The fat was carefully rendered to provide calories that would burn slowly through the night, and the meat itself was cut into pieces that would cook thoroughly but retain their ability to provide lasting energy. The vegetables that went into the stew were equally purposeful. Root vegetables that had been stored in underground pits, turnips, carrots, onions, provided not just flavor, but the kind of complex carbohydrates that would sustain energy through the long hours of cold. Dried herbs, carefully preserved from the summer harvest, added not just taste, but medicinal properties that helped ward off the illnesses that could be fatal in the depths of winter. But perhaps most important was the way the cooking itself was managed. The pot hung over the fire on iron chains that could be raised or lowered to control the heat, and Solveig adjusted it constantly, reading the bubbling of the stew like others might read the weather. Too hot, and the precious fuel would be wasted. Too cool, and the food would not provide the warmth that was needed. The cooking became a meditation, a careful balance between efficiency and effectiveness that required constant attention and years of experience to master. As the stew simmered, other preparations continued around the longhouse. The sleeping areas were prepared with a care that spoke to the understanding that a cold night's sleep could mean a weakened body the next day, and weakness in winter could quickly become something more dangerous. The beds were not simple piles of furs, but carefully constructed systems designed to trap and hold body heat through the night. The foundation was usually a wooden platform raised slightly off the ground to prevent the cold earth from drawing heat away from sleeping bodies. On top of this were layers of materials, each chosen for its specific properties. Dried grass and moss provided the first layer of insulation, creating air pockets that would trap warm air. Over this went layers of wool woven into thick blankets that had been treated with lanolin to repel moisture while retaining warmth. The furs that topped the sleeping arrangements were not random pelts, but carefully selected skins that had been prepared specifically for winter use. Bear fur, thick and dense, provided the ultimate in warmth, but was heavy and reserved for the coldest nights. Wolf pelts were lighter but still warm and had the added benefit of being large enough to cover an entire person. Rabbit fur, soft and light, was often used for children or as an additional layer when the cold was particularly bitter. But it was not just the materials that mattered. It was the way they were arranged. I watched as Astrid, Eric's daughter, prepared her sleeping area with the same careful attention that her mother gave to the cooking fire. Each layer was positioned to create the maximum amount of trapped air. Each fur was placed to overlap with the others in a way that eliminated cold spots. Each blanket was tucked and arranged to prevent drafts from finding their way into the warm cocoon that would protect her through the night. The evening meal, when it was finally ready, was more than just food. It was a ritual that brought the household together and prepared them mentally as well as physically for the night ahead. The family gathered around the fire, their faces lit by the dancing flames, and shared not just the warm stew, but stories, songs, and the kind of quiet conversation that helped pass the long hours of winter darkness. The stories were often about other winters, other times when the cold had been particularly fierce, or when clever thinking had saved the day. These were not just entertainment, but a form of education, a way of passing down the accumulated wisdom of generations who had faced the same challenges. A story about a winter when the main fire had gone out and had to be restarted might seem like simple tale-telling, but it was actually a lesson in fire management disguised as entertainment. The songs, too, served a purpose beyond simple pleasure. Many of them had rhythms that matched the work of winter, the steady beat of wood chopping, The gentle rhythm of spinning wool, the careful cadence of fire tending. Singing these songs helped maintain the mental discipline needed to perform these tasks correctly, even when cold and fatigue made concentration difficult. As the evening wore on and the time for sleep approached, the final preparations began. The fire was carefully banked, with coals arranged in the ash bed to provide heat through the night while conserving fuel. Extra wood was brought inside and placed near the hearth, where it would be dry and ready if the fire needed to be built up during the night. Water was brought in and placed near the fire, where it would stay liquid and be available for drinking or cooking without the need to venture outside into the bitter cold. The oil lamps that provided light were carefully tended, their wicks trimmed, and their reservoirs filled with the precious oil that had been rendered from fish or seals during the warmer months. These lamps would burn through the night, providing not just light for anyone who needed to tend the fire or check on the animals, but also a small additional source of heat that could make the difference between comfort and misery. Finally, as the household prepared for sleep, there was a final check of everything that could mean the difference between a safe night and a dangerous one. The doors were secured against the wind, but not so tightly that air could not circulate. The animals were checked one last time. The fire was examined to ensure that it was properly banked and would last until morning. And then, with the careful deliberation of people who understood that their lives depended on getting these details right, the family settled into their carefully prepared sleeping areas to wait for dawn. But even sleep in winter was different from sleep in the warmer months. It was lighter, more alert, with part of the mind always listening for the sounds that might indicate trouble, the wind picking up to dangerous levels, the fire burning too low, the animals becoming distressed. This was not the deep, careless sleep of summer, but the watchful rest of people who knew that survival required constant vigilance, even in dreams. There came a night, deep in the heart of winter, when the cold descended like something alive and malevolent, pressing against the walls of the longhouse with a force that seemed to test every joint, every timber, every carefully placed stone. This was the kind of cold that the old ones spoke of in whispers, the cold that could kill a strong man in minutes if he were caught unprepared, the cold that turned breath to ice crystals before it could leave the lungs. I felt it first as a change in the sound of the wind. What had been the steady moan of winter air moving through the trees became something sharper, more urgent, a howling that seemed to carry voices of its own. The walls of the longhouse, which had seemed so solid and protective, began to creak and settle as the extreme cold made the wood contract, opening tiny gaps that had not existed in milder weather. Eric woke first, his experienced ear catching the change in the wind's voice before anyone else stirred. I watched as he rose from his sleeping furs without disturbing his wife, his movements careful and deliberate despite the urgency he must have felt. This was not a night for hasty actions. In cold this severe, a single mistake could be fatal, and haste was the enemy of the careful thinking that survival required. His first action was to check the fire, and what he saw there made his face grow grave. The carefully banked coals that should have glowed red through the night had dimmed to barely visible embers, their heat being drawn away by the extreme cold faster than they could regenerate it. The fire that had seemed so secure when he banked it was now in danger of dying completely, and with it would go the warmth that stood between his family and the killing cold outside. But Eric had faced nights like this before, and his response was measured and methodical. Rather than rushing to pile wood on the dying embers, which might smother them completely, he began with the smallest possible intervention. A few pieces of the finest birch bark, dry as paper and rich with oils, were placed carefully on the glowing coals. Then, using the bellows with the gentlest possible touch, he coaxed the embers back to life, feeding them just enough air to encourage flame without overwhelming them. The bark caught with a small whoosh of flame, and in that moment of light I could see the relief on Eric's face. But this was only the beginning. The small flame needed to be carefully nurtured into something larger, something that could begin to push back against the cold that was pressing in from all sides. Thin strips of pine, resinous and quick to catch, were added next, their bright flames providing the heat needed to ignite larger pieces of fuel. As the fire began to grow, other members of the household began to stir. The extreme cold had a way of waking people even from deep sleep, as their bodies instinctively recognized the danger and called them to consciousness. But their awakening was not the confused stumbling of people roused from comfortable sleep. It was the alert, immediate awareness of those who understood that their lives might depend on the actions they took in the next few minutes. Solveig rose and immediately began checking on the children, ensuring that their sleeping furs had not shifted in the night, that they were still warm and safe in their carefully constructed cocoons of wool and fur. The children themselves, trained from birth in the realities of winter survival, remained still and quiet, understanding instinctively that this was not a time for movement or play, but for conservation of heat and careful attention to the adults who would keep them safe. Magnus, Eric's son, moved to check the animals, wrapping himself in a thick cloak of wolf fur before opening the door that led to the animal shelters. The blast of cold air that entered when he opened the door was like a physical blow, and I could see the flames of the fire bend and flicker in response. But the door was opened only long enough for Magnus to slip through, and it was closed immediately behind him, minimizing the loss of precious warm air. In the animal shelter, Magnus found what he had feared. The cattle and sheep pressed together in tight groups, their breath creating clouds of steam that froze almost immediately in the bitter air. The water in their troughs had turned to solid ice, and the animals were showing signs of distress, their usual calm replaced by the restless movement of creatures that understood they were in danger. But Magnus, like his father, had been trained for moments like this. He carried with him a small brazier filled with glowing coals from the main fire, and this he used to begin warming the animal shelter. The coals were placed in a metal container designed for this purpose, one that would provide heat without risk of fire, and around this small source of warmth the animals began to gather, their distress easing as the temperature in the shelter began to rise. Back in the main longhouse, Eric continued the careful process of building up the fire. Each piece of wood was selected for its specific properties and placed with the precision of someone who understood that waste was not just inefficiency, it was potentially fatal. The larger logs, which would provide the deep, lasting heat needed to get through the night, were positioned to catch the flames from the smaller pieces, but not so close that they would cause the fire to burn too hot and consume fuel too quickly. As the fire grew stronger, its warmth began to push back against the cold that had invaded the longhouse. But this was not a quick process. It was a gradual reclaiming of space, inch by inch, as the heat radiated outward from the hearth and began to warm the stones and timbers that would hold and reflect that warmth back into the living space. Astrid, Eric's daughter, had taken on the task of preparing hot drinks for the family, not just for comfort, but as a way of warming their bodies from the inside. She heated water over the fire and added herbs that had been dried and stored for just such occasions. Mint and chamomile provided soothing warmth, while ginger and other spices created heat that would spread through the body and help maintain core temperature through the long, cold night. The drinks were served in wooden cups that had been warmed by the fire, and each person held their cup with both hands, using it not just as a source of internal warmth, but as a way of warming their fingers and hands. This was not the casual drinking of warmer times, but a deliberate act of warming, each sip calculated to provide maximum benefit in the fight against the cold. As the night wore on, the family settled into the rhythm of extreme cold survival. Someone was always awake, always tending the fire, always listening for changes in the wind or sounds from the animals that might indicate new problems. Sleep, when it came, was light and interrupted, with each person taking turns at the watch that would keep them all alive until dawn. The fire became the center of everything, not just physically but spiritually. It was fed constantly but carefully, with each piece of fuel chosen and placed with the reverence due to something that held the power of life and death. The flames danced and flickered, casting moving shadows on the walls, creating a hypnotic display that was both beautiful and vital. But perhaps most remarkable was the way the family worked together, each person understanding their role in the collective effort to survive the night. There was no panic, no wasted motion, no energy spent on anything that did not contribute to the essential task of staying warm and alive. This was survival refined to its essence, stripped of everything unnecessary and focused with laser-like intensity on the fundamental requirements of life. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the small windows of the longhouse, the worst of the cold began to ease. The wind, which had howled through the night like a living thing, began to quiet. The fire, which had been fed and tended through the long hours of darkness, burned steady and strong, its warmth having successfully defended the small island of life within the longhouse against the vast ocean of cold that surrounded it. Eric looked around at his family, tired but safe, cold but alive, and allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. They had faced one of winter's greatest tests and had emerged victorious, not through luck or accident, but through the careful application of knowledge and skill that had been passed down through generations of survivors. The night was over, but the winter was not, and there would be other nights, other tests, other opportunities to prove that human ingenuity and determination could triumph over even the most hostile conditions that nature could devise. In the pale light of morning, after the night of deep cold had passed, I found myself reflecting on what I had witnessed, not just the techniques of survival, but the deeper wisdom that made such survival possible. For the Vikings who lived through these winters were not simply enduring hardship. They were practicing a form of knowledge that went far beyond the mere mechanics of staying warm. As the household stirred to life, I watched Eric examine the fire that had carried them through the night. The coals still glowed red at the heart of the hearth, surrounded by a bed of ash that had insulated them and kept them alive through the darkest hours. But Eric's examination was not casual. He was reading the fire like a scholar might read a manuscript, understanding from the color of the coals, the depth of the ash, and the way the heat radiated from the stones, exactly how the night had gone and what adjustments might be needed for the nights to come. This was knowledge that could not be learned from books, for there were no books. It could not be taught in schools, for there were no schools. It was knowledge that lived in the hands and the eyes, and the deep understanding that came only from years of practice, from nights when mistakes meant cold and cold meant danger, from the accumulated wisdom of generations who had faced the same challenges and learned, through trial and error, what worked and what did not. I watched as Solveig began the morning routine of cooking, But even this simple act was informed by the lessons of the night. The porridge she prepared was not just food, but medicine. Oats that would provide lasting energy, honey that would give quick warmth, and dried berries that contained the vitamins needed to ward off the illnesses that could be fatal in winter's grip. The way she stirred the pot, the temperature at which she cooked the grain, even the wooden spoon she used, all of these had been chosen and refined through generations of women who understood that in winter there was no such thing as a casual meal. The children, too, were part of this web of knowledge. I watched young Sigrid, Eric's youngest daughter, as she helped her mother prepare the morning meal. Her small hands moved with surprising confidence as she added pinches of dried herbs to the porridge, each addition made not randomly, but according to lessons learned at her mother's side. She was perhaps 7 winters old, but already she understood which herbs would warm the body, which would settle the stomach, which would provide the strength needed to face another day of cold. This was education in its most essential form, not the memorization of facts, but the absorption of wisdom through daily practice. Sigrid was learning not just how to cook, but how to read the needs of the body in winter, how to judge the quality of stored food, how to make the most of limited resources. These lessons would stay with her for life, and someday she would pass them on to her own children, continuing the unbroken chain of knowledge that had kept her people alive through countless winters. Magnus returned from checking the animals, and his report was encouraging. The cattle had weathered the night well, their thick winter coats and the warmth from the small brazier having kept them comfortable despite the extreme cold. The sheep, naturally hardy, had actually seemed to enjoy the crisp air, and the chickens, though they had huddled together for warmth, were already moving about and would soon be laying the eggs that provided precious protein during the lean months. But Magnus's report was more than just a simple accounting of the animal's condition. As he spoke, I could hear him noting details that would inform future decisions, which animals seemed most vulnerable to cold, which areas of the shelter might need additional insulation, which feeding strategies had worked best during the night. This was the kind of careful observation that separated successful winter survival from mere luck. As the morning progressed, I began to see how the wisdom of winter survival extended far beyond the immediate needs of staying warm. The way the family organized their day, the tasks they chose to undertake, even the way they moved through the longhouse, all of these were informed by an understanding of how to conserve energy and maintain warmth that went far deeper than simple technique. When Astrid went to fetch water from the well, she did not simply grab a bucket and run outside. Instead, she prepared carefully, wrapping herself in layers of wool and fur, covering her face to protect it from the bitter air, and carrying with her a small piece of iron that had been heated by the fire. This heated iron would be dropped into the bucket to prevent the water from freezing on the short journey back to the longhouse. A simple technique, but one that required forethought and understanding of how cold affected different materials. The water itself, once brought inside, was not simply poured into containers and forgotten. Instead, it was carefully managed, with some kept near the fire to remain liquid for immediate use, some allowed to cool for drinking, and some heated to provide the warm drinks that would help maintain body temperature throughout the day. Even something as basic as water became part of the complex system of winter survival. I found myself particularly fascinated by the way the family managed their clothing. In the modern world, we might think of winter clothing as simply putting on more layers, but for the Vikings, clothing was a sophisticated system of insulation and protection that required constant attention and adjustment. The base layer, worn next to the skin, was made of the finest wool, woven so tightly that it trapped air while still allowing moisture to escape. Over this went layers of increasingly coarse wool, each layer designed to trap more air while providing additional protection from wind and cold. The outer layer was often made of leather or fur, chosen not just for warmth, but for its ability to shed snow and ice. But it was not just the materials that mattered. It was the way they were worn. I watched as Eric adjusted his clothing throughout the day, loosening layers when he was working near the fire and needed to prevent overheating, tightening them when he moved away from the heat source, adding or removing pieces as the temperature and his activity level changed. This was not vanity or comfort. It was survival technique, for clothing that was too warm could cause sweating, and wet clothing in winter could be fatal. The boots, too, were marvels of practical engineering. Made of thick leather and lined with fur, they were designed not just to keep feet warm, but to provide traction on ice and snow. The soles were often studded with small pieces of iron or bone to prevent slipping, and the tops were tall enough to keep snow from entering while still allowing for the movement needed to perform winter tasks. But perhaps most impressive was the way socks were managed. Rather than simply wearing one pair of thick socks, the Vikings often wore multiple pairs of thin socks with layers of moss or dried grass between them. This created air pockets that provided insulation while also absorbing moisture, and if one layer became wet, it could be removed without compromising the entire system. As the day wore on, I began to understand that winter survival was not just about individual techniques, but about creating a complete system of living that took into account every aspect of existence in the cold. The way food was stored, the way work was organized, the way the family interacted with each other, all of these were part of a holistic approach to winter that had been refined over generations. The food storage, for example, was not simply a matter of keeping things cold. Different foods were stored in different ways, depending on their properties and the length of time they needed to last. Meat was often buried in snow, where it would freeze solid and remain fresh for months. Grains were kept in sealed containers that protected them from moisture and rodents. Root vegetables were stored in underground pits that stayed just above freezing, cold enough to preserve them but not so cold that they would be damaged by frost. The work, too, was organized around the realities of winter. Tasks that required fine motor control were done near the fire, where hands could stay warm and flexible. Heavy work was done during the warmest part of the day, when the body could generate heat through activity. And always there was the understanding that energy was precious and should not be wasted on unnecessary tasks. Even the social interactions of the family were shaped by the needs of winter survival. Conflicts were avoided not just for the sake of harmony, but because anger and stress could lead to poor decision-making, and poor decisions in winter could be fatal. The long evenings were filled with activities that brought the family together, storytelling, singing, crafts, not just for entertainment, but as a way of maintaining the social bonds that made cooperation possible. As evening approached and it came time to prepare for another night, I watched the family begin the familiar routine of banking the fire, checking the animals, and preparing their sleeping areas. But now I understood that these were not just practical tasks. They were rituals, ceremonies of survival that connected them to their ancestors and to the deep wisdom that had made their existence possible. The fire was banked not just to conserve fuel, but with the reverence due to something that held the power of life and death. The animals were checked not just to ensure their comfort, but as partners in the great enterprise of surviving winter. The sleeping areas were prepared not just for comfort, but as sanctuaries that would protect the most vulnerable members of the family through the dangerous hours of darkness. And as the family settled in for another night, I realized that what I had witnessed was not just survival, but a form of wisdom, a deep understanding of how to live in harmony with forces far greater than any individual human being. The Vikings who survived these winters did so not by conquering the cold, but by learning to work with it, to understand its patterns and rhythms, and to create a way of life that could flourish even in the harshest conditions that nature could devise. As the winter deepened and then, almost imperceptibly, began its slow retreat, I found myself witnessing something that went beyond mere survival. I was seeing the quiet triumph of human persistence over the most challenging conditions imaginable. The longest nights had passed, and though the cold still gripped the land with iron fingers, there were signs, subtle but unmistakable, that the great wheel of seasons was beginning to turn once more. The first sign was in the quality of the light. Where once the sun had barely cleared the horizon before beginning its descent back toward darkness, now it lingered a few minutes longer each day, its pale rays reaching a little further into the longhouse, touching surfaces that had been in shadow for months. Eric noticed this change before anyone else, his experienced eye catching the shift in the angle of the sunbeams that slanted through the small windows. But it was not just the light that was changing, it was the behavior of the fire itself. The carefully tended flames that had been the center of life for so many months no longer needed to burn quite so hot, quite so constantly. The coals that had required feeding every few hours could now last a little longer between additions of fuel. The stones of the hearth, which had radiated precious heat back into the room, now held that heat a little longer, releasing it more slowly into air that was no longer quite so eager to steal every calorie of warmth. I watched as the family began to adjust their routines in small but significant ways. The morning fire, which had been built up immediately upon waking to chase away the deadly cold of night, could now be allowed to burn a little lower while the family prepared for the day. The evening banking of coals, which had been done with the desperate precision of those who knew their lives depended on finding live embers in the morning, could now be done with slightly less anxiety, though still with the same careful attention to detail. The animals, too, seemed to sense the change. The cattle, which had stood pressed together in tight groups throughout the deepest cold, began to spread out a little in their shelter, no longer needing to share every bit of body heat to survive. The sheep, always hardy, began to show the first signs of restlessness that spoke of their instinctive knowledge that warmer days were coming. Even the chickens, which had barely moved during the worst of the winter, began to venture a little further from their huddled groups. But perhaps most telling of all was the change in the family's conversation. Where once the talk had been focused entirely on the immediate needs of survival, the state of the fire, the condition of the animals, the management of food stores, now there began to be mentions of the future. Plans for spring planting, discussions of repairs that would need to be made to buildings damaged by the winter's harsh grip, thoughts about the work that would begin as soon as the ground softened enough to allow it. Solveig began to speak of the seeds that had been carefully stored through the winter, wrapped in cloth and kept in the driest, most protected parts of the longhouse. These seeds represented not just the promise of future food, but the continuation of life itself, the hope that the cycle of growth and harvest would begin again, that the long months of living on stored provisions would give way to the abundance of a new growing season. Magnus talked of the repairs that would need to be made to the animal shelters, the fences that had been damaged by snow and ice, the tools that would need to be sharpened and prepared for the work of spring. But his talk was not the desperate planning of someone facing an impossible task. It was the confident discussion of someone who knew that the worst was behind them, that they had successfully navigated another winter and would soon be able to turn their attention from mere survival to the more pleasant tasks of growth and building. Even young Sigrid began to show signs of the change. Where once she had moved carefully and quietly, conserving energy and staying close to the fire, now she began to show flashes of the playfulness that had been suppressed by the serious business of winter survival. She would still help with the essential tasks, tending the fire, preparing food, caring for the animals, but now these tasks were interspersed with moments of laughter, brief games with her siblings, the kind of spontaneous joy that had been too dangerous to indulge when every calorie of energy needed to be conserved for survival. The food stores, which had been managed with the careful precision of those who knew that waste could mean starvation, began to be used with slightly less anxiety. There was still careful rationing, still the understanding that spring was not yet here and that the stored provisions would need to last until fresh food became available, but the desperate edge of deep winter conservation began to ease. Meals became slightly more generous, and there was even talk of celebrating the approaching end of winter with a feast that would use some of the precious stores that had been held in reserve for the most desperate times. But it was the fire that told the truest story of the changing season. The flames that had been the absolute center of existence, the difference between life and death, began to resume their role as simply one important element of daily life. The fire still needed to be tended, still required the same careful attention to fuel and air and the management of coals, but it no longer dominated every thought and action. There was space now for other concerns, other activities, other aspects of life that had been pushed aside by the overwhelming need to stay warm. I found myself particularly moved by the way the family began to prepare for the transition to spring. This was not simply a matter of waiting for warmer weather, but an active process of getting ready for the dramatic change in lifestyle that would come with the end of winter. Tools that had been stored away were brought out and examined, their condition assessed and repairs planned. Seeds were checked and sorted, with decisions made about what would be planted where and when. Plans were made for the cleaning and airing that would be needed to remove the accumulated effects of months of closed-up living. But perhaps most important was the mental preparation that was taking place. The family was beginning to shift from the inward-focused mindset of winter survival to the outward-looking perspective that would be needed for the active season ahead. Where winter had required patience, endurance, and careful conservation, spring would demand energy, initiative, and the willingness to take risks in pursuit of growth and abundance. As I watched this transition taking place, I began to understand that the Vikings' mastery of winter was not just about surviving the cold. It was about maintaining the physical and mental resources that would be needed to take full advantage of the warmer seasons when they returned. The careful conservation of fuel, food, and energy during winter was not just about making it through to spring, but about arriving at spring with enough strength and resources to plant, build, explore, and grow. The wisdom of winter survival, I realized, was inseparable from the wisdom of living a complete life in a challenging environment. The techniques that kept the family alive through the coldest nights were the same techniques that would allow them to thrive when conditions improved. The patience that was required to tend a fire through the long hours of darkness was the same patience that would be needed to nurture crops through a growing season. The cooperation that was essential for winter survival was the same cooperation that would make possible the complex tasks of building, trading, and community life that would resume with the warmer weather. And as the days continued to lengthen and the cold began its slow retreat, I could see in the faces of Eric's family not just relief at having survived another winter, but anticipation for the opportunities that lay ahead. They had proven once again that human ingenuity, cooperation, and determination could triumph over even the most hostile conditions. They had kept the flame of life burning through the darkest months, and now that flame was ready to grow into the full fire of spring and summer activity. The winter was not yet over. There would still be cold nights, still be storms, still be the need for careful fire tending and resource management. But the worst had passed, and the promise of spring was no longer just a hope, but a certainty. The great cycle was turning, and those who had learned to work with winter rather than simply endure it were ready to embrace the abundance that would come with the return of warmth and light. The scroll is closed now. The room is quiet. The candles are low. We have walked beside those who understood that survival was not about conquering the cold, but about learning to dance with it. Who knew that the difference between life and death could be measured in the careful placement of a single ember, the patient tending of a flame through the longest night, the wisdom to work with winter rather than against it. Their fires have long since turned to ash, but the knowledge they carried, the understanding of how to find warmth in the coldest places, how to create light in the deepest darkness, how to keep hope alive when the world itself seemed frozen. This knowledge burns on, passed down through generations like a carefully tended flame. Rest, if you wish, and know that somewhere in the quiet spaces between sleeping and waking, the ancient fires still burn, tended by those who understood that the greatest victories are often the quietest ones, won not with sword and shield, but with patience, wisdom, and the simple, profound act of keeping the light alive through the darkest hours. Until next time, this has been Yawn Through Time.